I get a lot of questions this time of year about, hey, how can I control the weeds in my clover food plots? Now, there's a good side to this, of course. The fact that you've got clover food plots is a good thing, and if there's some weeds in it, that's not the end of the world. We don't necessarily want to control weeds in our clover food plots just so those food plots look really nice and just so they look really good on camera and in our pictures that we share on Facebook and all that sort of thing, although, yeah, that's a lot of fun too. The important thing about controlling the weeds in your food plots is we don't want the weeds to overtake that food plot and make it so that the clover can't grow and can't flourish. Deer don't mind the weeds. As a matter of fact, they eat an awful lot of those weeds that you'll find in these clover food plots. Those are weeds that deer enjoy. For example, ragweed, that's the big pollen one that nobody likes around here, but the reality is deer really like ragweed. They'll eat ragweed and it's not a problem. So weeds in and of themselves in your food plots aren't necessarily a problem. But if we let those weeds and grasses get out of control, the problem can become that they'll overtake the food plot and eventually you won't have any clover left. I did another video on this, but crop rotation is important, and clover is an important part of your crop rotation strategy when it comes to your food plots. Check out that video. Basically, clover, as you know, is putting nitrogen back into the soil. It's fixing that nitrogen. It's making that nitrogen available to other plants. Now, from time to time, that also will feed those weeds. We don't necessarily want that, but by that same token, that doesn't mean that when we go back to plant turnips later on, after this food plot has lived out its entire life cycle here, once we go in and plant other plots, it doesn't necessarily mean that there isn't nitrogen left over for those new food plot crops. In fact, that's one of the reasons I really like clover, is that when I cycle in the turnips later on, it's going to produce an even better crop of turnips. When we talk about the weeds that we don't want in our clover food plots, usually what I'm talking about is grasses. All those grasses, they're not good for deer. They're not something deer are going to want, and they don't encourage the growth of your clover. So the grasses got to go. In addition to that, there are a lot of weeds like thistles and milkweed, stuff like that, that can take up a lot of nutrients. They can take up a lot of moisture and sunlight. They can compete with my clover, so they have to go as well. Plantain is another one of those species I don't like. I get an awful lot of plantain, both varieties. There's actually an English plantain and a regular plantain that we have here, very common. And both of those like to seed throughout the summer. They keep going to seed. They keep producing more seeds and more plantain. Deer will eat plantain, I guess, but I don't know that it's one of their preferred forages. Either way, it gets in the way of me growing a really good clover food plot, takes up nutrients, takes up moisture, so it's got to go. And of course, the other thing to think about when we're talking about all these weeds is the seed bank. If we can reduce the weed cover here, it will reduce the seeds that are left in the soil over the winter for future years. Lots and lots of seeds lay in this. Billions of seeds are laying in this food plot. When I go through and till, I'm waking up many of those seeds, bringing them back to the surface, giving them the right conditions upon which to grow and reseed and grow all those weeds or grasses. I don't want that necessarily. So by controlling the weeds, not allowing them to go to seed, we're at least trying to minimize or reduce the seed bank, all the seeds that are stored in this food plot. So what can we do about the weeds in our clover food plots? What can you do to reduce the weeds in those food plots, reduce the seed bank so there aren't as many weeds in the food plots going forward in future years? And what can we do to ensure that our clover food plots are going to last year after year after year and give us lots and lots of shot opportunities at deer perhaps over those clover food plots? What can we do? The most common solution to the weeds in your clover food plots is to mow those food plots. If you have a really big food plot, a good sized food plot, a third of an acre or more of clover, mowing is a great option. It is probably the easiest way to make sure that you're controlling the weeds and grasses in those food plots. And there are two really good reasons why you would want to go out there and mow those clover food plots. The first is, of course, weed control. Every time you mow it, you're taking the tops off of those weeds. You're harboring their growth, hindering their growth so they can't grow quite as well. You're removing the potential for them to go to seed and drop more seeds in the ground and produce more weeds down the road, perhaps. So mowing is a great option for that reason. Another reason, though, that you want to mow your clover food plots periodically is because it inspires new growth. If your clover food plots are going to seed with little clover, little white flowers, pink flowers, what have you, that's a great time to go out and mow the clover food plots. Don't mow them down short. You don't want to do that necessarily. You want to mow them up high, go through and take the tops off of that clover. It'll create more fertilizer, hold more moisture because of all that plant matter that's going down into that organic matter that's falling down in there. And at the same time, if the conditions are right, the clover will respond to that mowing by growing. It will grow and it'll start producing more and more clover and thicken your clover food plot. The downside of mowing, though, is, of course, that it doesn't necessarily control the grasses. If you watch Dr. Grant Woods here on YouTube, one of the things he commented on, and I love that, is the fact that we mow our lawns day after day after day or week after week. Every time you mow the lawn, it doesn't do anything to control the grass. In fact, the grass just grows back thicker. So mowing is not necessarily, it's going to cut back on that grass somewhat. It will reduce the length of those stems of grass, those blades of grass. It'll allow the clover hopefully to thicken and shield the sunlight away from some of that grass and maybe reduce the overall amount of grass that you have in your food plot, but it won't get rid of it. Grasses grow back, they just keep popping up, and they'll pop up and they'll get those blades up through the clover, and you're going to have grasses no matter what. So we got to look at other options if you have a lot of grass that you need to control. One big caution on mowing right up front, I want to tell you, if you have mowing to do in the spring when there are fawns on the ground, and you got to keep your eyes open about the area where you are putting in your food plots. Where I am, almost all of the fawns hit the ground in May, early June. That's when they are most vulnerable. I don't really have a second wave of fawns or a third wave of fawns coming in. They basically all hit the ground at the same time here. If you're in a place with really out of control deer numbers, you might have a second or third period in July or August even of fawn births, and that's when you got to be really, really careful with your tractor, four-wheelers, and what have you, and definitely be careful if you are out there mowing. You don't want to be out there mowing those clover food plots and run over a fawn. Not only is it counterproductive, it would be heartbreaking to me if that were to happen. So you have to be extremely careful of that possibility. To make sure that that doesn't happen for us, Genevieve and I always walk not only every square foot of this clover food plot, we walk 10 feet apart from each other so we can see every nook and cranny and walk the entire food plot before I mow. But we also walk the paths back and forth on foot. We walk back every place we're going to be taking the equipment to make sure that there are no fawns laying in there. Keep in mind that young fawns do not move. When they are really, really young, that is the only defensive strategy that they have. It's called the hider strategy. They just lay there and they aren't going to move. Just make sure that doesn't happen. Walk those clover food plots with a friend, family member before you go and mow. How often do we want to mow those clover food plots? Probably not more than 3 times a year, depending on how much moisture you're getting. Early in the spring, when you're getting hammered with rain here in northeastern Pennsylvania, great time to mow. Get out there and mow one time. I've always put it off because of my concern about fawns. This year I broke down and mowed, and I'm glad that I did. It is definitely a worthwhile enterprise if you can put in the extra time to make sure you're not hurting any fawns in the process. But you want to mow before a rain so that the clover can rebound and gives the clover the best chance of rebounding and flourishing after you mow and getting the benefit of that mowing. This food plot behind me is the well pad food plot. I mowed that not too long ago, and you can see it's thickening up quite nicely. I almost was planning on simply tilling this in. It got washed out in the spring, way too much rain, and the deer really hammered it over the winter. They needed this as a food source, and they really ate it right down to next to nothing and ate the roots and everything else. So I didn't know if it was going to recover or not. I mowed it, and so far so good. I think with a little bit of fertilizer late in the summer and some additional lime and another mowing later in the summer, I think we'll be all set for fall. This is not your lawn. You don't mow it every week. You don't mow it week after week after week unless the conditions are appropriate where you are. There's no substitute for going out there and spending some time on your clover food plots. Walk around them, spend some time out there and see if the conditions are right for mowing. Are you getting a lot of rain? Do you have really good soil conditions where that clover is really, really growing and do the weeds look like they're getting out of control? Good time to mow. On the other hand, you don't want to clip it too short in a dry season because it's going to have trouble rebounding. You can actually hurt your clover that way. Keeping that in mind, make sure you use your head when you're walking around there looking at it. That will tell you if it's time to mow. But in my experience, 2 or 3 times a year at the most here in northeastern Pennsylvania. You don't have to have a big brush hog to go out there and mow. You can use a weed whacker on your smaller plots. Third of an acre, I could probably weed whack this whole food plot in an hour or so if I wanted to walk through here and do it. This is about a third of an acre now. It used to be about half an acre, but it's grown in around the edges an awful lot. The buck field, on the other hand, you'd be all day going through that clover there because it's close to an acre in size. You probably would be all day if you were going to go through there and do that by hand with a weed whacker or any other tools. You certainly can use hand tools. There's a golf club looking thing, a little sickle, I forget what they call those. Somebody asked me recently on the Facebook page whether that could be used to do it, and it absolutely can. It is a perfect tool. You go through there, take the tops off all those weeds, make sure that they are injured that way and ready to, hopefully you'll help the clover take over those little food plots. On a real small food plot, I actually go through and weed them by hand. It takes me 15 minutes to weed the ridge clover food plot. I have a little in the woods staging food plot that I put in there, and that food plot I can weed by hand with a pair of gloves in 5 minutes. All it takes is a pair of gloves. Go in there and do it. So you don't necessarily have to have big equipment to take care of these clover food plots. Now, what do we do if we've got these clover food plots and we can't get the equipment in there? We don't want to, the mowing is not doing the job, or I just don't have the equipment to mow. Is there a way to take care of the weeds and grasses in your clover food plots without that equipment? The answer to that question, of course, is yes. There's a couple of options. First of all, RoundUp. Now, RoundUp kills just about everything. You spray it on there, unless it is an engineered plant like a Roundup Ready soybean or corn, RoundUp will kill just about anything it touches. You got to be real careful that you don't get a breeze where it blows that Roundup onto your apple trees or something like that, for example. Roundup's a big concern for that reason, but a low mixture of Roundup, and I am not going to do, I've never done this, and I'm not going to give you instructions on how to do it, but there are videos here on YouTube, and there are other resources on the internet that can point you in the right direction about how to use Roundup to control weeds and grasses in your clover food plots. Basically, the theory is clover is a very hardy plant. It is a very hardy crop. It's very durable. It will survive a very low mixture of Roundup, survive it, and come back. More so than the weeds and the grasses that inhabit that plot alongside the clover. The theory is if you mix it like a 1% mixture of Roundup and you keep your levels really low, go through with that Roundup, or glyphosate as it's called, is the actual product. But if you go through with that chemical and you spray that on your food plots in a weak enough mixture, the clover will survive, but the weeds and grasses will not. That's the idea behind it. Again, I've never done it. If you do it, let me know on the Facebook page, let me know here on YouTube how it works out. On the other hand, you don't necessarily have to use a 1% mixture. I have used Roundup on my clover food plots where the weeds tend to clump up. I get in the buck field, for whatever reason, a lot of thistles, big old thick thistles. I can go through there with a bottle of Roundup, just a mix. I mix up a bottle of Roundup, go through there and spot spray the problem areas. I hit that thistle with some Roundup, come back in a week and it's gone. It's all dead and rotted right down. And then I can take some clover seed and I can mix it in, throw it on that hole, let it soak in, let the rain hit it, and grow new clover in that exact spot. Do the same thing with milkweeds if those are a problem in your food plots. And if you have clumps of grass, you can go through and spot spray Roundup right out of a bottle off the shelf. Go through and spray those big clumps with Roundup. It will take care of it. Now that's the full strength Roundup I'm talking about there. I have done that over the last few years in the buck field, for example, where I've had clumps of weeds or grasses, and it's worked just fine. In fact, I've top seeded those little spots, filled them in nicely, and they have grown just fine. And we're not done yet. If you've got clumps of weeds and grasses in your food plots like I do in the buck field, you can go through with a hand tool and dig them out, either a hoe, or if you've ever seen Don Mealy's hunting channel here on YouTube, I'll put a link in the description. He used an adze. Really handy tool. I have one actually, and you can go through and use that tool to remove the entire root system of that plant. Just pull it out of there, throw some clover in the hole, throw the clump of weeds out on the edge of the food plot, and you're good to go. If Roundup's not doing it for you, if you don't want to spot spray and your grasses and weeds are mixed throughout your food plot, then Roundup probably isn't the best option unless you want to experiment with that 1% mixture. If you don't want to experiment with that, there are two other chemicals you can use for clover that work fantastically. I have used them and I can tell you that they are good products if they're used properly. Slay and arrest are the two that I'm talking about. Those of you who follow this channel will remember that I've done other videos on those two chemicals. You can check those out. Follow those instructions perfectly and you won't be disappointed. Now, they don't have a turnaround quite as quickly as RoundUp. If you've used RoundUp, you know that you come back in a week and you can definitely see the results in only a few days, but definitely after a week you can see the results of the RoundUp in anything you've sprayed it on. Slay and arrest are slower killers. It might take a couple of weeks to see the results, and you may not even see those weeds brown right up and disappear the way they do with RoundUp. In fact, what you might see instead is those weeds and grasses start to yellow and eventually dissolve. You'll slow the growth of those until the clover just overtakes them. That's kind of how slay and arrest have worked in my experience. Arrest is the product that targets all the grasses, and that's clethodim is the actual chemical in that. You can buy it in bulk if you want to and just buy that product. Buying a proprietary brand like Arrest is going to be pretty expensive. Slay and Arrest are not cheap. They're nowhere near as cheap as RoundUp is. But if you're buying them in bulk, you can save some money. If you've got really big food plots, then you might want to consider buying them in bulk. I have about an acre of clover, nearly an acre of clover up here in the buck field. This is about a third of an acre right now. My other doe field clover food plot has grown under, and I'm getting rid of that food plot entirely. I'm going to till that under and plant turnips there. So I don't have another plot to use it on. I really don't have enough clover here, at least at this time, to justify buying that stuff in bulk. The slay is some kind of acid. To be honest with you, I can't even pronounce it. It's a really long name for that acid that's in the slay product. I don't know what the generic of that is. There's a Butarac 200 or something like that you can buy that's basically the same product. Again, if you want to buy those products in bulk, not a bad idea. To me, the slay and arrest, again, they're very effective, but they're kind of like the last resort for me. I try to handle everything with mowing. That's the easiest way. I have the equipment. If you don't, that's a different consideration. I have the equipment to do the mowing, so I try to handle the weeds and grasses with the mowing. That's my first effort there. RoundUp, I've used that, like I said, to get rid of some of the clumps of weeds and grasses in the buck field. I've had great success with that. Hand weeding in the smaller food plots, another great way to handle this. But even in that small food plot, in the ridge staging clover food plot, I do have a problem now with chickweed, which is like really low to the ground and kind of gets in there under all of the clover. So I can't go through and get that by hand. I can't pull it out. If you do, you're pulling out an awful lot of clover, and it's a small plot. I'll end up with basically a big bare spot that takes up a third of that whole food plot. So I really can't handle it that way. In that ridge staging food plot, slay and arrest are the best of choices because it can go through and it can clean up those thistles that I can't get by hand, and the chickweed that I can't get by hand. It can help take care of those weeds and grasses without ruining the entire plot. The other reason that slay and arrest are kind of last line of defense for me, it's like the last option, is because they're kind of expensive, but also because, from what I've read, they lay in the soil a little bit longer, for like up to 3 months. So you can't plant something else in there for 3 months other than clover. Not necessarily a problem, it depends on what your plans are with that area. But with RoundUp, once it's done its job and killed that grass, killed that weed, essentially that stuff becomes inert and does not affect the soil. You can go through and plant. You guys have used RoundUp, know that, and I know from experience that you can go through and spray it and 3 days later plant, and it's literally 3 days later you can go through and plant and you're going to have a good crop. The RoundUp is not going to affect any future crop in that area. Slay and arrest are slightly different. They lay in the soil for 3 months or so, according to the research that I read online, and I can put links to that stuff in the description as well. And that's a concern, because if that stuff's laying in there, then you can't go through later in the summer and till that up, plant something else. It may jeopardize that future crop. I do have a few more tips for if you really want to make your clover food plots succeed, you want to make them flourish. There are a few other things you can do to increase the likelihood that you'll get 3 or 4 years out of your clover food plots, in addition to all that weed control. Don't be afraid to shoot some woodchucks. Woodchucks eat clover. They love it. They will lay in here. They will put holes in here, woodchuck holes that are going to be dangerous for your tractor, dangerous for your deer, dangerous for you to walk through here as well. And they eat the clover. We don't necessarily want to make really nice food plots for everything that's out there. Woodchucks aren't benefiting my deer hunting at all. I'm not doing this to benefit woodchucks. I don't have a problem with shooting every woodchuck that I see. In fact, over the last couple of years, I've shot nearly 24 woodchucks off of this place. Never going to get rid of all the woodchucks. It's that simple. I can just shoot every year, shoot a half a dozen or a dozen woodchucks, and you'll still have lots of woodchucks to go around, but you'll minimize the damage to your property, minimize the damage to your clover food plots, minimize the damage to your barn's foundation, the foundation of your house, things like that, potentially as well. So there's nothing wrong with removing some of those woodchucks. In addition to that, the other thing you're going to want to do is reseed when necessary. If you see bare spots in your clover food plots, spots where you've controlled the weeds and now there's a bare spot, top seed some clover seed. I keep 5 pounds or so of clover seed in the Ranger at all times. Go through there, just take a handful, spread it around good before a good rain, and you should be replenishing your clover and keeping it going just fine. Fertilizer, another good thing for your clover food plots. Got to fertilize it. It likes a 210-40 or some kind of fertilizer that is heavier in the potassium. That's what clover's looking for. You don't have to worry about the nitrogen. Don't be adding nitrogen to your clover food plots. We're looking for something like a 210-40, a 0060, any of those types of fertilizer. If you talk to folks at your local ag store or local co-op, they'll be able to point you in the right direction for the right type of fertilizer for your area that's available there. People ask me from time to time about Jolt fertilizer as well. I don't know that Jolt will do anything bad to your food plot. It certainly isn't going to hurt your clover. There's phosphorus in it, which clover likes as well. And there is some potassium, so it is going to benefit your clover. It will boost your clover. But the danger with Jolt and fertilizers like that, Jolt is a product from Antler King. Jolt's a product that I use in all my brassica food plots. It's a great product. But the problem is, a lot of the weeds that we're trying to get rid of in here, a lot of the grasses that we're trying to reduce will benefit from Jolt. So if you're spraying Jolt on your clover food plot without taking care of the weeds, without taking care of the grasses, you may be actually helping those grasses and weeds with your Jolt spraying. So keep that in mind. You may, depending on the weed cover, you may not want to use like a foliar fertilizer like Jolt on your clover food plots. So just keep that in mind. And of course, lime. Never hurts to put some lime out there. I use pelletized lime. I've done a couple of videos on that as well. Check those out. Never hurts to go through, throw a whole bunch of lime out there. If you do that, you will have happy, healthy clover, nice, tasty clover for your deer. And of course, most importantly, just keep an eye on your clover food plots. There is nothing more fun on a weekend morning to get up, get a cup of coffee, and go stroll around and check out your clover. Take a little walk in your clover and enjoy those clover food plots. Look for pests, look for weeds, keep an eye on what you need to do, and then get after it and do it. And your clover food plots will reward you with year after year after year of growth, and they will reward you with lots and lots of deer, hopefully. So good luck out there with your clover food plots. I hope you have as much luck with them and as much appreciation for your clover food plots as I have. Thank you for watching this episode of Death by Bunjie. Make sure you subscribe if you haven't already. Check out the Facebook page too, because I post a lot of updates on food plots and other little projects going on around here on there as well. So check that out if you haven't. And until next time, all hail Bunjie!